Good evening, everyone. And I am Christopher Ebert, and I am the interim director of the Wolf Institute for the Humanities, and also a professor in the history department. Shout out to my class that would normally be meeting now, Atlantic World. Thanks for attending as well. And this is the 13th of the Robert L. Hess Memorial Lecture events that we've had at Brooklyn College. The lectures commenced in 1993 and are named for Robert L. Hess, who was Brooklyn College's president from 1979 until his death in 1992. Since then, the college has benefited from gifts from the Hess family to support this and other events, as well as library collections. What brings you here this evening is the highlight of the week-long Hess Scholar in Residence program, the purpose of which is to invite a leading intellectual who can make connections and empower conversation among the disciplines offered here at Brooklyn College. The program has been arranged every year or so since 1993, with support coming from Robert Hess's widow, Frances, who played a large role in the program's success and attended every lecture until her passing in 2015. Nevertheless, Hess's legacy remains alive today at Brooklyn College through the continued generosity of the family, and we continue to honor the diversity of Brooklyn College's students and faculty by hosting these events and collaborating across the disciplines. I would like to thank the people who helped make this possible briefly, including the members of the nomination committee and the planning committee. And I won't name all of the names, but they're in the program. And so please take a look. And if you see them, thank them as well. We would like to thank the president's office, President Anderson and her chief of staff, Nicole Hess, who were very supportive of getting this all together. There have been a lot of threads coming together. Many thanks to the program coordinator, recently named HEO at the Wolf Institute, Suklima Roy, who is one of the bedrock people in this institution and this event as well, too. Thanks, and a great pleasure to see the former long-term director of the Wolf Institute, Robert Viscusi, as well. We're very pleased to have you as well. And so I'm going to turn over the introduction of our scholar in residence, Edwidge Danticat, to my colleague in the English department, Ronald Howell. Ronald Howell was a journalist working for decades, and was also a foreign correspondent covering Latin America and Caribbean. In the course of fulfilling duties in that career, his destiny crossed that of Ms. Danticat, which I'm guessing he will probably tell you about. He has been a journalist with Newsday, New York Daily News, Ebony, Baltimore Evening Sun, and ABC News and the Associated Press. And now is in the journalism program in the English department at Brooklyn College. I'm very pleased to have him introduce our guest for the evening. Ron?
What a pleasure to be here. I had a friend once whose class I was speaking to at Columbia Journalism, and he mentioned where I'd worked and how many different jobs I'd had, and he said, I know what the first question is going to be. How old is this guy? Yeah. But, you know, I consider myself very fortunate to have been a journalist, really, really blessed. First of all, let me thank again President Anderson for making this possible, and, you know, I didn't have the honor of knowing him, but Robert Hess, of course, you know, just a wonderful opportunity for scholars to be here at Brooklyn College. And, of course, Chris Ebert. If you ever get a chance, by the way, and sit down and chat with him about how he got into Brazilian history, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. I had the chance to sit with him and Edwidge just chatting earlier this week. And of course, Suklima, who's I've worked with on a number of projects over the years. And I think she's wonderful, writer, editor, much better organized than I am, and I relied on her for so many things over the years. I think the problem with me, you know, introducing someone like Edwidge is it's where to begin, you know, where to end. She's going to talk about third culture kids, and you know, in some respects, Edwidge to me is a kid. I like to think of her as a sister and embracing her, but you know, she is the next generation for me. It was in the mid-90s, after she had published her first two books, Crick Crack, Breath, Eyes, and Memory. I was talking with her, and I may have been interviewing her, and it turned out she knew my name, and I was so flattered, and she told me why. As a reporter for Newsday in the 1980s, I was traveling to Cuba and Haiti, and in April of '89, oh boy, it was such a difficult time in Haiti's history. You had a faction of the military battling with another faction, and I was there, and it was gunfire for several days. And at that point in my life, I had been around some in Central America, but I was really, really close this time, and hid out with some journalist friends until it all subsided. And then we went, as journalists do, walking around and trying to find where the stories were. And we chanced upon this funeral procession that was like a procession in New Orleans with the music. And there was something really striking about the folks I saw. Sometimes you can just sort of sense from a distance that you have some kind of connection. And so I wound up writing about it, and I learned that it was a young lady who had died, and I just wanted to know more. So right away, you know, I got phone numbers of family members, and I called and was able to speak with Joseph Danticat, Reverend Joseph Danticat. And the striking thing was that I had studied quite a bit of French and I was comfortable speaking French. And what struck me was the raspiness of his voice. He had had a laryngectomy. And the only person I knew in my life who sounded that way, and it was exactly that way, was my paternal grandfather, who died in the early 60s. And it was almost like I could see my grandfather as I was listening to Reverend Danticat. And he was telling me about his niece, whose funeral had taken place that day. And so I wrote a story based largely on what I had learned from Reverend Danticat. She had died, as it turned out, of fright. She wasn't even, and I had actually seen people who were shot. I saw a kid my son's age at the time, and I'll never forget it. He was shot in the head, and I mean, and these people were just out there in the street, and we were kind of roaming around. And this funeral, there was something, I'll have to say classy, you know, about the folks. And so I wrote a story about it. And it wasn't until maybe 10 years later in that conversation with Edwidge, she said, well, I know you because you wrote an article, and I've saved it all these years, and that family that you wrote about was the household that I grew up in Haiti. And I said, oh my God. And so I felt I had this connection. And then I've come to believe in miracles. It turned out later that same Reverend Danticat himself had to flee Haiti, like many others have had to do over the decades. And he was held in Florida. There he was, the uncle of an esteemed writer, recognized all around the country, and held. They wouldn't let him go, even though he tried to plead his case. And you know, from all appearances, certainly someone like myself, just based on what he looked like and what he sounded like, would have said, hey, you know, let the guy go. But they held him. And he died, you know, he died. And it was obviously because they wouldn't let him go. And I think he had some medication that they called voodoo medicine, you know, grabbed it away so they wouldn't let him have it for his, I believe, hypertension. And he died. And I've always thought, you know, how shocking, not shocking, but hurtful that was to Edwidge. And I feel like I have to apologize really, for not having done something in my own life to make sure that that would not happen to Reverend Danticat. But that led, of course, to the book, Brother, I'm Dying. And I remember talking with Edwidge after the book, and I said, you got back, at the, with that book, and the detail in that book. She had transcripts of what was said with her, and it was embarrassing, and they'll look like fools, like idiots, till the end of time, till the end of time. And in some way, I was very humbled because, I've done some investigative reporting, and I've had great investigative reporter friends, but that topped it. And here she is, a novelist, and writing, one of the best investigative stories out there. So that's the story of our connection. But, it goes on and on, really. It turns out her uncle was buried in Cypress Hills Cemetery, I believe. My family is buried in Cypress Hills and Evergreen Cemetery. I'm not even sure I ever told you that. But my family came from the island of Nevis in the early part of the 1900s, and they stayed here. So my great-grandfather I actually did get to know for a bit. And, he had his story to tell also. He went back to Nevis for the first time in 1954. He went there and was just going to stay a while. And he died there. I mean, there was something in him that, you were saying that too about your uncle, that he really wanted to, they buried him here, but you knew he really wanted to be in Haiti. And so he died over there, and his daughters, my grandmother and aunt, went and brought him back. They actually buried him there. They had him disinterred and brought him back and placed him in Evergreen Cypress Hills Cemetery. So on it goes. I said one miracle after the other. The last I'm going to leave you with is that the person who made all of this possible and opened doors for me to go to travel to Cuba and to Haiti was a guy named Les Payne, who was a terrific. I mean, some say he was, well, he's certainly one of the greatest journalists of the latter half of the 20th century, and more significant for black journalists, I think, than any other person. He's kind of the Frederick Douglass of our generation. And as I said, he opened doors for me. He collapsed and died at his home last Monday. And for me, this is another miracle. I had set up with Edwidge, arranged for Edwidge to go to her middle school on Monday, and we were going to be there till 4 o'clock. Well, it turned out the wake for Les was 5:30. It was almost like he was saying, I'm going to set this up so you can do that with Edwidge, drive to Harlem to Abyssinian Baptist Church, and everything's okay. And that's the way it was. Miracles, one miracle after another. Edwidge, I'm just so proud and pleased that you were able to come, and you do so much for me. And your lesson to me is that writing is fighting. And I just thank you over and over again for teaching that. And I'm sure students are getting stronger from the association with you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? I feel like this is blocking a whole side of the room, but it's an immovable object. Can you hear me all right? Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Ron, for that wonderful introduction. And thanking Ron, I was going to tell that whole story of of my cousin and that terrible death, in which I detail in Brother, I'm Dying, and I also mention Ron because the fact that he was a witness to that situation gave us so many more details about, I feel like my life has been a series of joy, but also a lot of mysteries in the deaths of the people I love. And Ron's work as a journalist in Haiti gave us so much light in terms of framing the history of my family at that time, but also gave me a proper way to honor my cousin, and the way that he described that funeral, which many of the people in my family were unable to attend because it was a very difficult time politically, but also because of their different varying type of documentation. So I want to thank Ron for all the role you've played in this visit, and for everything you've done yourself as a journalist, but all for that particular gift to my family, and for the wonderful introduction, and for bringing me back to the middle school where I started like 30 some years ago, and the building looks the same, which I thought, except some parts look a little smaller, which happens when you grow up, right? And I want to also thank President Anderson, Ms. Hess, Suklima Roy, and Chris Ebert from the Wolf Institute. Thank you, Regine, for coming. Regine was there at the very beginning of my career in public life, you know, as a writer as well, just in the same way that Ron was. So it's wonderful for you all to have you in the room. It's also a great honor to be the Robert L. Hess Scholar in residence this week. Every time I come to Brooklyn College in any capacity, it's an honor, because I feel like I've been part of the Brooklyn College family for so many years. My brother and sister-in-law got their education degrees here. My nieces have gone to sort of toddler school here, and Brother I'm Dying was a first read, and I've spoken at the commencement. I've taken shortcuts to the campus to get to my brother's house from the train on Flatbush. So this feels kind of like more like a homecoming than a visit, and then a visit in this very esteemed scholar, you know, and former president of the college, the name in his name. And in some of the materials I've read about Robert Hess, he's referred to as a restless intellectual. He's a specialist in 19th century African history. I think in that capacity, the only thing we might share is restlessness. But I would hope that he would be interested in some of what I will share with you this afternoon. And the talk and the words that I'm about to share with you are part of an ongoing exploration for me. It's not something definitive, but it's something that I keep trying to write about in different ways, about certain issues and struggles that connect different people in the African diaspora, both in pain and in jubilee. And some of this exploration is guided by the work, particularly the essays of the great writer and activist James Baldwin. And this exploration, on a personal note, is also about what I want to share with my children, my two daughters, about our past, our current moment, as well as their future. So here it goes, and Ron, let's do this one for less pain. A right to be here, race, immigration, and my third culture kids. In the summer of 2015, soon after the one-year anniversary of the fatal shooting of the teenager Michael Brown by Ferguson, Missouri police officer Darren Wilson, I was in Haiti, on the southernmost border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, where hundreds of Haitian refugees had either been deported or had been driven out of the Dominican Republic by intimidation or threats. Many of these men, women, and children had no warning that they were going to be picked up or chased away, and most of them had fled with nothing but the clothes on their backs. It was a bright sunny day on the border town of Ansapit, but the air was so thick with dust that as some friends and I walked to the makeshift resettlement camps on the Haitian side of the border in a place called Pacado, it felt as though we, along with the residents of the camp, were floating through clouds. Around us were lean-tos made of cardboard boxes and sheets. Dust-covered children walked around looking dazed, even while playing with pebbles that stood in for marbles, or while flying plastic bags as kites. Elderly people stood on the edge of food and clothes distribution lines, some too weak to wade into the crowd. Later, the elderly, along with the pregnant women and the disabled, would be given special consideration by the priest and the nuns who were giving out the food available to the camp dwellers. But the food would always run out before they could get to everyone who needed it. A few days after leaving this Haiti and this camp and returning to the United States, I read a Michael Brown anniversary opinion piece in the Washington Post written by Rahat Orhani, an immigration attorney and law professor. In her essay, Orhani argues that under certain circumstances, African Americans living in the United States could also qualify as refugees. Citing many then recent cases of police brutality and killings of unarmed Black women, men, and children, including Michael Brown and Sandra Bland, Eric Gardner, Walter Scott, and Tamir Rice, Orhani wrote, quote, "Suppose a client walked into my office and told me that police officers in his country had choked a man to death over a petty crime. Suppose he said police fatally shot another man in the back as he ran away, that they arrested a woman during a traffic stop and placed her in jail where she died 3 days later, that a 12-year-old boy in his country was shot and killed by police as he played in the park. Suppose he told me that all of those victims were from the same ethnic community. At this point, as an immigration lawyer, I would tell him he had a strong claim for asylum protection under US law," end quote. Having now visited many refugee and displacement camps, the label of potential refugees at first seemed an extreme designation for Professor Orhani to assign citizens of one of the richest countries in the world. Still, her argument took me back to some specific memories from my own life. I have seen state abuses up close, both in Haiti, where I was born during a ruthless dictatorship, and in New York, where I migrated to East Flatbush, nearby, at age 12. In the Haiti of the 1970s and early 80s, the violence was overtly political. Government detractors were imprisoned, beaten, or killed. In New York, the violence seemed a bit subtler, though very much also here. In the 1980s, when I started riding the New York City transit buses to the high school I attended 3 miles from my home, Clara Barton High School, I noticed that a muffled radio message from an annoyed bus driver about someone talking too loud or not having the right fare was all it took to make a police car pull up, have the police rush in, drag a young man off the bus, and beat him into submission on the sidewalk. There were no cell phone cameras back then to record such abuse, and most of us were too terrified to demand a badge number. Besides, many of us had fled our countries as exiles, migrants, and refugees just to escape this type of military or police aggression. So we knew how deadly a confrontation with an armed and uniformed figure could be. Still, every now and then, a fellow traveler would summon up his or her courage and, dodging the swaying baton or screaming from a distance, would yell some variation of, "Stop it, stop it, this is a child, a baby, a child." Of course, not all of the police's victims were children. Abner Louima, who is a family friend, was 30 years old when he was mistaken for someone who had punched a police officer outside a nightclub not far from here on August 9, 1997, 16 years nearly to the day that Michael Brown was killed. Last summer, new coverage of the 20th anniversary of Louima's attack brought back all those memories again, reminding us how little things have changed. Abner was arrested, beaten with fists as well as with police radios, flashlights, and nightsticks, then was sexually assaulted with the wooden handle of a toilet plunger or a broom inside a New York City precinct bathroom. After Abner, there was Amadou Diallo, a Ghanaian immigrant who was hit by 19 of the 41 bullets aimed at him as he retrieved his wallet from his pocket. There was Patrick Dorismont, someone who might now be called a third culture kid. Third culture children or children who are raised outside of their parents' native culture for a significant part of their developing years. Patrick Dorismont, the US-born child of Haitian immigrants who died in March 2000 trying to convince undercover cops that he was not a drug dealer. These are only among the few cases from that era that made the news. I have no doubt that there were many others, including ones involving women of color who were killed by police. The few got so much attention, except the 60-year-old Eleanor Bumpers, who 13 years before Abner's assault was killed by police with a 12-gauge police shotgun inside her own apartment in the Bronx. We marched for all of them in this borough in the Louima Diallo Dorismont Bumpers decade. We carried signs and chanted, "No justice, no peace. Whose streets? Our streets," even while fearing that this would never be true. The streets, we worried, were never ours to begin with, just as they hadn't been in the homelands we were fleeing to obtain safety here. When it was announced that Darren Wilson, the Ferguson police officer, would not be indicted for the killing of Michael Brown, I kept thinking of Abner Louima, whose assault took place when Michael Brown was just 18 months old. Abner and I have known each other for years. Both our families attended the same Creole-speaking church for decades, a church founded by his uncle, also not far from here. So I called him to hear his thoughts about Michael Brown's killer going free. If anyone could understand all those broken hearts, all the rage, the yearning for justice, I thought he could. How does he feel each time he hears that another black person was killed or nearly killed by police? I asked him. It reminds me that our lives means nothing to them, he replied. We are here in America because some of our lives meant little to the powers that be where we came from. Some of our parents and grandparents fled prisons, torture chambers, hid, then ran for their lives. They were exiles, refugees. Some of us are too. In 2004, as Ron described, my 81-year-old uncle, a survivor of throat cancer who spoke with a voice box, was fleeing a United Nations ambush of his house in Haiti, which led to the death of some young man who then tried to kill him. He came to Miami, where I'm living, and even though he had been coming to the United States for 30 years as a visitor, expressed that he would now have no home to return to for a while and requested asylum at the airport in Miami. He was immediately arrested and detained. His medications for high blood pressure and an inflamed prostate were taken away from him, and he died in the prison ward of a hospital, chained to a bed 5 days later. I wrote a book about this called Brother, I'm Dying, which some of you have read. It's the book that was chosen as the first-year read at the college some years ago. So we are here, many of us, because our lives might have meant little or nothing where we came from. Then we come to realize that our lives can also mean very little here. Some of us try to distance ourselves from this reality, thinking that because we are the good immigrants, the good migrants, the good refugees, the good blacks, that this is not our problem. That is until we realize the precarious nature of citizenship here, which has been made even more precarious with the current leadership of this country, with a president who thinks that the police are too nice, that our men are rapists or bad hombres, that we come from shithole countries, and that white supremacists are good people. Not to mention an attorney general who has praised a eugenics-focused 1924 immigration law that puts restrictions on Jewish and Italian immigration as good for America. So the precarious nature of our citizenship, or our less and less attainable citizenship, if we are the 800,000 DACA recipients around the country, or the Haitians and Salvadorians, and as of yesterday, Liberians who have lost their TPS or their temporary protected status, we realize that we too might be prey. If that those who have been in this country for generations, walking, living, loving in the same skin we're in, that if they, in some circumstances, can have their voting rights questioned and have to keep affirming their rights to exist and that their lives matter, if they could all possibly qualify for refugee status according to an immigration lawyer, then we're all in the same fight, aren't we? Parents are often too nervous to broach subjects like this with their children. These and among other difficult subjects like love, sex, death, race. Sometimes we're forced to have these conversations early, too early. A broken heart might lead to questions we'd rather not answer, as might an inappropriate gesture, the death of a loved one, or the murder of a stranger. Each time a young black man or woman is killed, either by a police officer or a vigilante, I ask myself if the time has come for me to talk to my daughters about Abner Louima or Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland or Renisha McBride, and the long list that follows. Just as each time there's a school shooting, I find myself reinforcing the active shooter drills my children are participating in regularly now, and telling them to listen carefully and do everything their teachers or the police officer or school security guard assigned to organize the active shooter drills tells them to do. Be sure to hide under the desk just as you're told, I remind them, or stay in the closet, and if you're in the bathroom, stay there. Do what the teacher says, I tell them. Do what the officer says. Do what they tell you to do so you can stay alive. I certainly would not want my daughters to grow up terrified of the country and the world they live in, but is it not irresponsible of me to at least not alert them to the potential life-altering or even the life-ending horrors they might face as young people in today's world, as young black women, as the children of immigrants in a large family of immigrants with various types of immigration status. They will, at some point I realize, need a series of urgent talks. My daughters, as the artist Kara Walker has referred to herself, are also urgently gendered persons. So there will also have to be, sadly, have the talk about toxic masculinity and sexual assault. In his own version of the talk, James Baldwin wrote to his nephew James in My Dungeon Shook in his seminal essay In the Fire Next Time. He wrote, "You were born in a society which spelled out with brutal clarity and in as many ways as possible that you are a worthless human being." That same letter could have been written to a long roster of dead young men and women, including most recently Stephen Clark, who was shot in his grandmother's backyard last week. It's heartbreaking to imagine what these young people's letters from their loved ones, the letters meant to save their lives, might have said. Would their mother or father, their favorite uncle, aunt, grandmother, or grandfather warn them not to walk in certain neighborhoods, to impossibly avoid police officers, to never play in a public park, to stay away from neighborhood watchmen, to never go to a neighbor's house, and even in danger seek help, to never have a phone that some police officer might mistake for a gun? Instead of writing love notes, birthday cards, Father's Day wishes, these parents must now issue post-death statements expressing their pain and their children's and loved ones' humanity at the same time. Just as the parents of children killed in previous school violence and in nightclubs or at concerts, at least the ones I saw at the March for Our Lives I attended with my daughters on Miami last Saturday, just as they were doing in cases where their children cannot speak for themselves, just as Trayvon Martin's mother and these other mothers have been doing for years now. I am still in my own mind drafting a My Dungeon Shook letter to my daughters, Mira, 13, and Layla, 9, and my list of concerns keep growing every day. There is their race, their vulnerable black bodies, there is their gender, the possibility that one day they might be in a painful position of having to write the hashtag #MeToo. There's their vulnerability in public places, as I recently found out on Christmas Eve in a mall in Aventura, Florida, when I found myself leaving my car running in a parking lot, then hiding in a bush after fleeing from what I believed was an active shooter in a mall when some kids were just carrying out a hoax. That's happened in 3 Florida malls last year. My Dungeon Shook letter to my daughters often begin like this. Dear Mira and Layla, I have put off writing this letter to you for as long as I can, but I don't think I can put it off any longer. Please know that there will be times when people might be hostile or aggressive or even violent to you for reasons that have nothing to do with who you are, that have nothing to do with your beauty, your humor, or your grace, but only your history, your gender, and the color of your skin. Please don't let this restrict your freedom, break your spirit, or kill your joy. And if possible, do everything you can to change the world so that your generation of brown and black men, women, and children will be the last to experience all this. And please do live your best lives and achieve your full potential. Love deeply, be joyful, and Jubilee, Mom. To my draft of this letter, I often add snippets of James Baldwin's letter to his nephew as well as other works. I tell you this because I love you, and please don't ever forget it. James Baldwin reminded his namesake nephew James, know whence you came. If you know whence you came, there is no limit to where you can go. The world is before you, I want to tell my daughters, and also you today, and you need not to take it or leave it as it was when you came in. I want to look happily forward. I want to be optimistic that they will have a life full of hope and opportunities. I want them to believe that they'll survive to have a life if they hide in the right places when the shooters come. I want them to actually believe that the future is female, so globally female that the Brazilian activist Marielle Franco will not only get justice in her country, but that the causes she championed, justice for the poor and women and the disenfranchised, will continue to be heard around the world. I want to tell my daughters to be fierce feminists. I want them to not live from painful anniversary to painful anniversary or from one sad commemoration to another, but to live in total jubilee. I want to tell them that they can breathe. I want my daughters and all of you this afternoon to feel that they have the power to at least try to change things, even in a world that can try to resist change with more strength than they have. I want to tell them that they can overcome everything if they are courageous, resilient, and brave. Paradoxically, I also want to tell them, and also you, that as James Baldwin said, our crowns have already been bought and paid for, and that all we have to do is put it on our heads. But the world keeps stripping me up. My certainty keeps failing, because every day we wake up, some other group of rights are being chipped at or being taken away, or some other group of people are being told en masse to go away. I want to tell them, as James Baldwin wrote in an essay called They Can't Turn Back, a 1960 essay about meeting with student activists in Tallahassee, that, quote, while all of us have been there, no one wishes to remember the really agonizing privacy of the very young. They are only beginning to realize that the world is difficult and dangerous, that they are themselves tormentingly complex, and that the years that stretch before them promise to be more dangerous than the years that are behind. I want to tell them that again, in more of Baldwin's words, that decisions made at this time always seem, in fact, nearly always turn out to be decisions that determine the course and the quality of your life. I wonder for the first time what it can be like to be making in the adolescent dark such decisions as this generation of students are making, James Baldwin wrote of the 1960 Tallahassee student activist. They are in a battle with more things than can be named, he wrote. Not only must they summon up the force to face the law and the lawless, they are also dealing with problems yet more real, more dangerous, and more personal than these. They are dealing with who they are, what they want, and how they are to achieve what they want. I want to tell my daughters, just as I want to tell all of you, that they cannot stand by and watch, that we must join each other's causes, have each other's backs, form alliances, practice in what in Haiti we called combite. Today you work my land, tomorrow I work yours. Jacques Romain, the great Haitian writer whose novel Gouverneur de Laosé was translated by Langston Hughes, wrote that cooperation is the friendship of the poor. Poor or rich, we need that kind of cooperation and these types of friendships now. These are the kinds of things I write in this never-ending letter to my third culture gals. Remember to sing, I tell them, lift every voice. I want to tell them, even if you sing badly like me. sang a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. I want them to look back in wonder and amazement and in love, because when you study history and the gains people have made against impossible odds, and the Haitian Revolution or the Civil Rights Movement and the dismantling of apartheid, it's harder for you to give up in despair. And if you feel frozen and overwhelmed, just take one small step at a time. This I do tell them. So, in the summer of 2015, I took my daughters to that border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. There they saw and helped comfort men, women, and children who look like them, but are stateless refugees, other types of third culture babies, with not even a bed sheet between them and a dirt floor. Young people who may not be killed by bullets, but by the much slower assault of diseases like cholera. These are all our causes. I tried both to tell and show them. Brown and black bodies living with certain uncertainty, to use Frantz Fanon's words. Black bodies fleeing oppression, persecution, and poverty, here, there, wherever they are. Those bodies could have been ours, I tell them. In fact, they are ours. They are us. We are them. You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read, James Baldwin wrote, or you see, or you weep, or you pray, or you speak, or you write. You raise your voice in some way, you make yourself heard, and you realize, as Baldwin said, that the things that torment you are the very things that connect you with all the people who are alive and who have ever been alive on this earth. So you take your little, a big fighting step so that one day everyone will be able to walk the earth as though they too, to use Baldwin's words about the 1960 Tallahassee student activists, as though they too have a right to be here. These children remind me of all the Negro boys and girls I have ever known, Baldwin wrote of those student activists in 1960. And they remind me of myself, but really, I was never like those students. It took many years of vomiting up all the filth I had been taught about myself and half believed before I was able to walk on the earth as though I had a right to be here. You can only rest, I want to say to both my daughters and to you. You can only rest, and you can only finally claim that crown of yours and put it on your head when the bowed heads of the hungry are finally raised and the curved backs of those who have been senselessly made mourners are straightened. When we stop asking when it will end for some of us and not all of us, when there are more bridges than walls between us, when we can all vomit the filth we've been told about ourselves and the filth we're still being told over and over about our neighbors, and fully and respectfully walk this earth as though we all have a right to be here. Thank you.
Ms. Danticat would be willing to take a few questions from you before we go.
When we were at Edwidge Middle School on Monday, you told the students that you it was a recollection of your first time here, and you arrived on Friday, speaking no English, only Creole and French, and you went to school here for the first time. You were at school on Monday. And look at who you are now. What is your advice for someone who wants to know what it takes to do that? Is it just you? Is this who you are, it's so different? Or is it your family that was a very strong family, what's the reason?
Well, one of the things that I wanted those children to know too, that it's my, and one of the things that sort of pains me and all the stuff you see with immigration too is that the opportunities my families have, a lot of other families won't have. and my dad was a cab driver, my mom worked in a factory, and it had to do with them, but it also had to do with the fact that that school was there, right? And that I had access to it. There are places where, you know, some kids who had just arrived wouldn't have access to that school. And so I got that beginning also because that opportunity was there, and I had wonderful support along the way. But I think someone said this yesterday at the immigration panel, I think it was Carolina, and I think it's worth repeating, that in immigration narratives, we don't just go to, you know, because there's a tendency to just to go towards, like, to talk about either the people who have committed crimes on that side and then the exceptional cases. So, but there's so many people who are toiling in between, and my parents were certainly that. And my father, for example, went to, you know, he went to the principal at Clark Barton High School and says, you know, my daughter has to go there because she's going to be a nurse. So I'm sorry, Papa. And just like there was that part of it too. But I think it's the opportunities. I had a wonderful teacher there, Mr. Danticat there. So it's drive and definitely opportunity. We can't overestimate the having opportunities and things put in my path that I was able to take advantage of at the same time.
Hi. I actually met you for the first time at LA Giving, and you signed my book, Brother, I'm Dying. And I told you that I wanted to be a writer, and you told me that I could be whatever I wanted to be. I could achieve anything. And the next semester, I changed my major to lit. So
you didn't tell your parents that was my because they're going to come after me.
You know Haitian parents. They were really upset when I said.
Boy, don't give them a number.
But, well, right now I'm here taking education, but my question is, what advice would you give someone who's stuck in the writing process, who just have so much to say, just don't know what to say and how to say it?
Well, it's just like I was saying in the talk. It's take one little step. You know, just start. It's one of I think the biggest thing to any task, especially writing, and especially if you've been, you know, encouraged away from it, is fear. And there's different types of fear. There's the fear of failing. There might be fear of exposing things about yourself. But it's just to just do it. Like if you need to give yourself like a time to just free write, or if you have to make it arbitrary in the beginning, just like, okay, I'm going to free write for 20 minutes and when I wake up, or something like that to get you going. But also to examine, and that's true for everybody who writes, like why you're stuck. It may be that the thing needs, what you're working on needs a little more stewing and so forth. But to plunge in, and if it's fear that's holding you back, to just go ahead and do it. And also read things. I mean, reading, for me, when I'm stuck, I read, and I feel like I'm being taught by that reading, you know, based on a kind of reading like a writer, as Francine puts it, and finding things that I can learn from the things that I'm reading, so that you're still working even though you're not actually in the active process of writing. But it's all I see you followed also this other track. When I went to get my MFA, my parents were like, MFA? What's an MFA? And I said, I can teach, and they were like, oh, thank God.
Letter and your advice to your daughter. You talk a lot about them joining the causes of other people, so brown people, black people, immigrants. What do you think, or what would you advise them in regards not to the relations with allies, or relations with potential enemies, or, you know, like anything from authorities that might oppress them, to people who support in a sort of the supposedly good people that just voted for Trump because they wanted their jobs back. You know, what would be the the attitude towards those people who might be potential enemies or oppressors? Would you recommend law of resistance? I don't know.
Well, I think what you're hinting to is constructive dialogue, right? And I think, like my kids have probably been to more demonstrations than they want to have attended, but you're right, it is a challenge, and we were talking about this yesterday too in a class. It's a challenge to talk to people who have opposing views and to do it civilly, and I think especially in this climate. But the people on the other side have to want to talk to you. Do you know what I mean? They have to believe you're human and worth talking to. And if someone is echoing something like that says that they think you're from a shithole country, they don't think you're worth talking to. So I think the dialogue has to be desired on both sides. And of course, yeah, we don't. I often use the model of writing to talk to my children about disagreement. And I said, well, sometimes you need input, and you need some. You could read a book that helps you see things in a very different way. You can talk to a person who gives you an idea that you have not been told before. But that person has to. There has to be some baseline. They have to believe that you're a person too, just like them, and that you're worth talking to. And we can't always make those assumptions these days, So it would be great to have civil, conversation about disagreements. I think people sometimes do it very well in academia. Sometimes not so well, but sometimes very well. But both sides have to believe that the other side is worth speaking to, right? And the other side can't just believe that you should be on a boat back to Africa or that you should be back to the country you come from, and then they're not going to. It's not a conversation. One more, if there is one more. Back there.
Can you talk more about the direction of your work as you are fleshing out this sort of thinking around what sounds like kind of transnational African diaspora solidarity, and maybe where its resistance is most directed? It sounds very much like towards the mentality of sort of global colonialist capitalism that justifies the devaluing of black and brown bodies. But I'm just curious what direction you're taking this in.
Well, one thing that I've in those years, like through that whole journey of those different types of situations, that's been heartening to see is that, for example, before the Diallo situations, there was Youth F. Hawkins. There would be these deaths, and people would say, okay, this is like an African American child who was killed because he was in a white neighborhood. And then when it was Abner and Amadou Diallo, then you start, that was even the beginning of the immigrant communities are like, oh, this can happen to us too. And so, like my parents went through these demonstrations, and they're the most like apolitical people. And so that started, and what I'm starting to see too is that even amongst younger people, so you'll have Dream Defenders with the Dreamers marching, and that's been really good to see, like this building of coalitions and this kind of awareness. And I think sort of these times are so that they're almost demanding a new kind of activism, a new kind of these coalitions that in some cases were there all along, but are reinforced by the fact that so many of us feel under threat, or even more under threat than usual. So I think for me, it's just like it's about awareness, and I literally mean like that something that I want to share with these two young girls, and then the people in my life, and then in the wider circle because of what I do. But it is an exploration. How do we do that? First of all, to not feel like I'm standing alone in the middle of this, and that it's never happened before, because it has. And what can we learn from the people who have faced these struggles before? What can they teach us as we, as we don't even know what comes ahead and, next? Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.